Adjournment.
Move this to no adjournment.
Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr. Jim Fitzpatrick.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the opportunity to raise the concern of many of my constituents at not only the breathtaking decision of the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police Service not to prosecute following the judgment of the Election Court in the case of fraud at the 2014 mayor election in Tower Hamlets, but also about the way that decision was communicated. If I may, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to lay out some brief background. There have been regular allegations about electoral fraud in Tower Hamlets almost every election in recent years. Following the 2014 mayoral election and the chaos, especially at the count at the Truxey Centre, many complaints were again registered. This time, however, there was a major difference. Again, in the absence of prosecutorial action and to the embarrassment of local political parties, 4 brave citizens, Andy Earlham, Debbie Simone, Asmal Hussain and Angela Moffat, decided at considerable personal risk to raise a private prosecution at the Electoral Court. This court, as you know, Mr. Speaker, has all the powers of the High Court or the Court of Session. As long ago as 1947, a report produced by a committee considering electoral reform commented that irregularities in elections should not be regarded as a private wrong which an individual must come forward to remedy, but as attempts to wreck the machinery of representative government and as an attack upon national institutions which the nation should concern itself to repel. The committee also noted that the integrity of elections concerns the community as a whole. I think these words should give us some idea as to the enormity and the significance of what the 4 Tower Hamlets petitioners did, not only for Tower Hamlets, but for the whole of the national electorate. Indeed, the judge stated, to bring an election petition as a private citizen requires enormous courage, involving for the petitioners a potentially devastating bill of costs. He also observed the misery that the petitioners faced whom, to quote, would be portrayed as racists and Islamophobes attempting to set aside the election, and so it proved. The petitioners have been duly vilified, but they've hung in there. No one would have suffered in this respect more than petitioner Asmal Hussain, whose efforts to highlight and bring an end to corruption in the borough of Tower Hamlets brought all manner of vile abuse to his door, literally. The verbal abuse and threats lasted right through to the case in the High Court. Asmal Hussain was told he should die for challenging the election result and was despised as someone who failed to join others in the view that ethnic and religious solidarity should outweigh any respect for democracy and fair play. Mr. Hussain's van and restaurant window were vandalised, but he stayed resolute and strong. The judge also quite rightly said in his judgment, the court expresses surprise that this petition was not brought by the Labour Party. His words resonate embarrassingly with many of us. It should not have been left to 4 tenacious and brave individuals to insist that democracy, not Cray Twin-style gangsterism, should be the system that governs in the London borough of Tower Hamlets. I would also like to say a word briefly in praise of Mr. Hoare, who provided the legal representation for the 4 plaintiffs. And I echo the sentiments of the judge when he said in his judgment, for Mr. Hoare, this has been a complete tour de force. He accepted the case on the basis of direct access, as his 4 clients could not afford to instruct solicitors. Of his efforts, the judge said, by any standards, this was a considerable feat and worthy of the admiration of the court. After a trial lasting 30 days, with Mr. Richard Mowry QC sitting as a judge, on the 23rd of April 2015, Luke Rahman was reported personally guilty and guilty by his agents of corrupt and illegal practices, of making false statements of fact about another candidate's personal conduct or character, of administering council grants in a way which constituted electoral bribery, and of spiritual intimidation of voters. He was also reported guilty by his agents of personation, postal vote fraud, fraudulent registration of voters, and illegal payment of canvassers. Quite a list. The judge also stated the financial affairs of Tower Hamlets First, THF, were at best wholly irresponsible and at worst dishonest. In terms of character assassination, the judge's observations indicated he recognised this kind of activity not only during the election campaign but also with the court. In referring to evidence given by THF members against a woman giving evidence against them, he said the three men were quite deliberately lying. In the end, the election of May 2014 was declared void, with Mr Raman disqualified from holding electoral office for 5 years. The court judgment says these penalties are entirely separate from any criminal sanctions that might be imposed if the candidate concerned is prosecuted to conviction for an electoral offence. In an article in The Guardian, Dave Hill said of Judge Morey, he did not give Raman a back alley kicking of the type that recur in the more gruesome East End mythologies, but he did dish out a legal equivalent. As I understand it, the level of proof required by an election court is equivalent to criminal law, not civil. The judgment states it is settled law that the court must apply the criminal standard of proof, namely proof beyond reasonable doubt, and later stated, thus the court will apply A, the criminal standard of proof to the charges that Mr Raman and or his agents have been guilty of corrupt or illegal practices, B, the criminal standard of proof to the question of whether there has been general corruption. The plaintiffs have been seeking costs. The Solicitors Regulation Authority has recently confirmed that Mr Raman is to appear before their disciplinary tribunal. At the very least, there are suggestions that he's been hiding his assets, offloading to his family, or not declaring properties owned here and in Bangladesh. As reported recently in the East London Advertiser, the £500,000 legal cost of the original 6-week election trial was awarded against Raman, but he hasn't paid a penny towards it. Although the article went on to say £3 million worth of property assets have been frozen, the 4 petitioners are still trying to recoup heavy financial losses from him. There is talk of a property in Bow owned by Mr Raman in Bow, although it takes some effort to get beyond the layers of complication regarding his properties, with his wife claiming part ownership and beneficial interest. Then there is undeclared income to the taxman on 2 properties they rented out. It seems money and property are sloshing around, adding additional features to the catalogue of wrongdoing. Mr Raman, meanwhile, has declared himself bankrupt. In referring to the question of property, the judge referred to a particular address and its place within this narrative of dodgy dealings. This was number 16 Prioress House, and the fact that 2 THF candidates had asserted that they lived at that address. The judgment declared, I am completely satisfied that neither of these 2 THF candidates ever resided at 16 Prioress House. They were guilty of an offence under section 61. Moving on to issues surrounding grants, the judge was able to draw a number of conclusions, among which, for the record, were enormous sums of public money has been paid to organisations in excess of that which council officers had recommended, and in many instances to organisations that had not even applied for grants. A total of 15 applications receiving aggregate funding of £243,500 did not meet the minimum eligibility criteria and so were not scored by officers. Further 21 applications totalling £455,700, which did meet the minimum eligibility criteria but did not meet the minimum quality threshold score of 40, were successful in the final awards. By way of another example, grants totalling just under £100,000 were handed out to 10 organisations, all Bangladeshi or other Muslim organisations, for lunch clubs, where none of them had even applied for a grant. Organisations deemed totally ineligible found themselves grateful recipients of tens of thousands of pounds of public money. £352,000 was awarded without an open application process from a fund called the 954 Fund. Shadwell's grant increased from £204,386,000 to £460,750, more than doubling. Subsequently, Shadwell returned 2 Tower Hamlets first councillors. On the other hand, in Bow East, the grant reduced from officers' recommendation of £99,397, cut by roughly a third to £67,000. The opposite effect to that of Shadwell is all too clear. Bow East returned 3 Labour councillors. We can do nothing but conclude that Tower Hamlets first candidates were able to benefit from circumstances in which their party invested money locally. The judge's conclusion, I quote, Was the making of those grants corrupt? Again, this seems inescapable, unquote. He observed, quote, bribery by any ethical or moral standards, unquote, but posed the question, is it bribery contrary to section 113 of the 1983 Act? In terms of formal conclusions in the judgment, the report says, the court is satisfied and certifies that in the election for the mayor of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, held on the 22nd of May 2014, the first respondent, Mr Raman, was personally guilty and guilty by his agents of an illegal practice contrary to section 106 of the 1983 Act. The first respondent, Mr Raman, was personally guilty and guilty by his agents of a corrupt practice contrary to section 113 of the 1983 Act. The first respondent, Mr Raman, was personally guilty and guilty by his agents of a corrupt practice contrary to section 115 of the 1983 Act. Scotland Yard dropped its investigation into electoral fraud after finding, quote, insufficient evidence that criminal offences have been committed, unquote. Mr Speaker, how does that tally with the election court's findings? Given that detectives launched their investigation after Mr Raman was found guilty of corrupt and illegal practices, how can practices with such a description not be worthy of prosecution? I have written to the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner on these matters and have secured a meeting soon with Commissioner Hogan Howe when I hope to raise these and other questions. The police findings have led Mr Raman's supporters to claim he has been proven innocent of all charges. Who can blame them? As pointed out by local Conservative councillor Peter Golds, quote, if the police fail to prosecute, there are no convictions and therefore no fraud, and even a successful election petition can be swept under the carpet when the police do nothing, unquote. It should be noted that the judge paid tribute to Councillor Golds, by whom the petitioners had been greatly aided. The Bangladeshi media in Tower Hamlets have indeed reported events as anticipated. Mr Ted Jury, a reporter of a high reputation who has long taken an interest in these matters, says, quote, the Bengali media failed miserably in their journalistic duty to hold the borough's leaders to account. Instead of without fear or favour, there was far too much fear and they were full of favour. Lukeforth demanded almost nationalistic loyalty to his cause and it was given. They did their readers and viewers a huge disservice, unquote. Mr Speaker, I hope you can imagine the consternation all this has caused in Tower Hamlets to all of our residents interested in democracy, regardless of their colour, religion or background. In terms of the various views of the court and its findings, I feel it is worth pointing out, contrary to what Mr Raman's supporters have espoused, that the judge was not interested in indulging in a wholehearted blinkered condemnation of the former mayor. However, the judge highlighted the extent to which the former mayor's supporters nursed and perpetrated the belief that they and their candidate were victims. He said, quote, in their minds, they were being targeted because they were Bangladeshi and Muslim, so their critics were necessarily racist and Islamophobes, unquote. These swiftly dispatched jibes not only slander, besmirch and cause distress, as they are designed to do, to those innocent of such charges, they devalue the terms and diminish the plight of those who experience and suffer real prejudice. The election court says he's guilty, but the CPS and the MPS say there's not enough evidence. But there are also suggestions that other inquiries are ongoing into aspects of fraud and corruption. I'd be grateful if the Minister could outline exactly what is going on here. What inquiries are still ongoing? Where do the plaintiffs stand in respect of recovering their costs? Where do the voters stand in terms of having confidence in electoral arrangements in the future? The government has appointed commissioners to rebuild public confidence that the system can protect against bribery and corruption, is robust enough to prevent those who have contempt for our democracy and from continuing to undermine it in the future. Can the Minister reassure us that the new Mayor, John Biggs, and the commissioners are on track to deliver? In conclusion, Mr Speaker, With the greatest respect to the Minister, I had expected the Police Minister to be responding to this debate, or in his absence, perhaps the Minister responsible from the Ministry of Justice. I got a very nice letter from the Police Minister saying a Minister from DCLG would be responding, and we have the Cabinet Office Minister who's actually responding, and he knows I hold him in high regard. And with no disrespect to him, for me, it don't matter. I want a government response. I'm sure the Minister is very able to do that, because these are serious matters, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Minister does have a good response to reassure the good people of Tower Hamlets that the authorities will defend their rights, ensure our elections will not be stolen again in the future, and that the petitioners will receive the costs to which they are entitled. Thank you, sir.
Minister for the Cabinet Office, Mr. John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, I should start by saying I hold the honourable gentleman in equally high regard. He was very kind in his remarks about me just now, and explained to him that he will appreciate from the title of the debate that he has chosen that this is a topic which falls neatly between three different departments. You could argue that parts of it need to be responded to by the Department for Communities and Local Government, parts of it perhaps by the Policing Minister, and parts of it, those to do with electoral fraud, by myself from the Cabinet Office. So I am here this evening wearing three hats with three sets of different briefings, and I will endeavour to cover the entire waterfront, but I'm sure that we can follow up with any points which the honourable gentleman may have as follow-up questions as we go. But I will endeavour at least to cover all the issues that he has raised. And can I start, Mr. Speaker, by congratulating him on raising this issue. It isn't just something which is important to his constituency and the borough in which he operates, although it is undoubtedly crucially important there, but it is something which I think has resonance in many parts of the country. Thankfully, electoral fraud is not something which is terribly common in Britain. It's not something which we encounter very often. There's a steady trickle of allegations and occasionally of successful prosecutions and problems with our elections, but it is only a trickle. But of course, as the old saying goes, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. It would be entirely wrong for us to become complacent about this. The only way in which we can maintain an otherwise, I think, enviable set of trust and widespread trust in this country's elections is if we take problems such as those as they occurred in Tower Hamlets extremely seriously when they do crop up, and make sure that there is no repetition, and that anybody thinking of misbehaving in the same way finds it incredibly difficult and is dissuaded from going down that route. Good.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Can I just put on the record my personal admiration for, frankly, the heroism of those people who took this matter to the Electoral Court? And would he not agree that it would be a betrayal of their courage if the police, for reasons of political correctness, were not to follow through on what appears to be, in the case laid out by the honourable gentleman who has spoken, open and shut matter of criminality?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was in fact just about, my honourable friend anticipated my next remarks, because I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to the four petitioners, and we just heard how they were pretty heroic in the way they pursued this. They were not dissuaded. There were plenty of opportunities where lesser people might have backed away, and they did not take those opportunities. They pursued it through thick and thin, and on occasions it was pretty thick and pretty thin what they had to put up with, and yet they continued throughout. And I think we all owe them a debt of thanks, particularly obviously those locally in Tower Hamlets, but not just to those four petitioners. There are other people who I think have picked up the challenge as well. My honourable friend, or right honourable friend, the former Secretary of State, MP for Brentwood and Ongar, who put the commissioners into Tower Hamlets in the first place, the commissioners themselves, of course, and presiding Judge QC, Richard Morey, and a number of other officials have been brought in as well, including people like Barry Quirk, and we've already heard the assiduous and determined campaign mounted by local councillors such as Peter Golds as well. So many people have rallied round the cause of democracy in Tower Hamlets, and I think that is all to the good. And now I hope the honourable gentleman will appreciate I can't necessarily comment on the details of specific investigations that are still ongoing. He is a very experienced parliamentarian and also an experienced former minister as well, so he will understand the constraints on what I can and can't say. But I think he is doing entirely the right thing. He mentioned in his remarks that he is about to have, I think, discussions and meetings with Commissioner Hogan-Howe and perhaps others as well. And I hope that they will be able to provide him with further reassurances about what is going on with those current investigations. I understand that there are still investigations, for example, into grants fraud in parallel with the investigations into electoral fraud. Those are still ongoing too. They aren't something which perhaps can be made public, but he may be able to get more reassurance. And I hope he will also, I'm sure he will also, pursue assiduously and very determinedly the point made by my honourable friend that there were some extremely trenchant criticisms made by Richard Morley in his judgment. And while many people may have been expecting that therefore it would be straightforward to come up with a prosecution, clearly there are different standards of proof. As he mentioned, there are also different levels of admissibility of evidence. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service need to make a judgment, but he will want to pursue the individual cases and the individual allegations to find out what can and cannot be pursued. And I think that local people in Tower Hamlets and more broadly in the electoral community more widely will want to know, well, how can we be sure that these sorts of cases will be pursued in the strongest possible terms whenever the evidence allows? So I would encourage him in those meetings and pursuing those inquiries that he plans to have. I also understand he asked where do the plaintiffs stand in respect of recovering costs. He then gave, I think, at least a partial answer to his own question by talking about some of the discussions and investigations that are still ongoing to the ownership of various assets associated with Mayor Rahman or perhaps with members of his family. There have been a number of press stories and a number of reports of court judgments about what has and has not been found to be either the property of former Mayor Rahman or indeed his family. I understand that process is still ongoing, and again I'm afraid I can't comment much beyond that, but that is not a story which is finished, not a set of conclusions which have been finally reached. And I think that the mills of both God and in this case the justice system are grinding forward slowly, but one hopes exceeding small as well. He also asked about how we might take forward the broader question of how electoral fraud can be made less easy. It's not easy in the first place, but how it can be made even more difficult to perpetrate, and to make sure that the consequences of electoral fraud are clear, swift, and unappealing to people considering undertaking it. And there I go back to mentioning my right honourable friend, the member for Brentwood and Ongar, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. He is at this moment working on a report for the government, which will be landing, I suspect, on my desk with a satisfactory, large and weighty thud at some point in the next few weeks or maybe a month or two, on electoral fraud, and with a series of recommendations into how we can tighten rules still further. I obviously wouldn't want to prejudge the results of what he might recommend, but the honourable gentleman will appreciate that, having been Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and I think before he came into this House, Mr. Speaker, a leader of a local council as well, my right honourable friend will have observed local democracy up close. He will have seen its strengths and its weaknesses. He will have seen the local democratic process in huge detail, as well as the parliamentary democratic process. And I think that I can't think of anybody who is better placed to come up with some trenchant and I hope closely reasoned recommendations. So I look forward to receiving those, and I think that all of us will want to read them and consider them in quite some depth. Beyond that, of course, we will have to wait and see what he recommends, but I can confirm that both he and I have spent some time with Richard Morley, for example, discussing what he saw both at Tower Hamlets, but also in his previous judgment, since he has something of a track record of specialising in this area and of examining a series of problems, thankfully not terribly frequent, but where they have come up, he is probably the single person with the best judicial experience in the country, and so we've spoken to him, and we've also spoken in depth to people like Peter Golds, who he mentioned as well. So there's been plenty of care taken to gather whatever information is available out there, and therefore I'm sure we all wait to see the results of my right honourable friend's report as and when it arrives. The honourable gentleman's final question was where the local righting of the ship has got to in Tower Hamlets. And I have made some inquiries of Department for Communities and Local Government just to see where we've got to on that. And I think the answer is broadly that there has been huge progress, but there is still further to go. I understand that that the Council has made some progress against some key areas in its best value action plan: procurement, property disposals, elections management, and there's been particular progress, I can tell the honourable gentleman, since the arrival of Mayor Biggs last June and the new CEO Will Tuckley in October. However, there are still concerns over delays in other intervention areas, in particular grants, communication and organisational cultural changes. Some of these things obviously take longer to bed in. And progress in these areas, Mr. Speaker, will need continued and close monitoring by the Commissioners to make sure that progress so far is not eroded and does not start to flag. So I think that the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government will continue to monitor very closely and will not consider any variation to the current directions until there is sufficient evidence that the change has been deeply embedded and that the key outcomes have been delivered. I'm sure that the honourable gentleman would want that to be the criteria. Clearly, given the seriousness of the problems that were encountered, and he very ably and very lucidly summarised the worst of them, but there were many others which he wouldn't have had time to go into. Given the seriousness and the acuteness of those problems in Tower Hamlets, I'm sure that he will applaud every move to make sure that there is no prospect of a reoccurrence and that therefore those standards have been fully attained before we are able then to get back to, I'm sure, widely wished for normality in the electoral arrangements and the registration arrangements in Tower Hamlets. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I hope that answers the honourable gentleman's questions. Where I haven't been able to answer them because they are subject to ongoing investigations, he is quite rightly, and I applaud him for it, going to speak to the police and the police commissioner himself and others, and I hope he will get the answers there which he cannot get here. And if he pieces those various parts of the jigsaw together, I hope that he will therefore have an optimistic picture, albeit one which cannot yet be said to have solved the problem, but at least there is progress and a problem that is being solved, even if we've not quite reached our final destination.
Order. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.